and welcome to MintCasts, our MintPress podcast series. I'm Mnar Muhawesh, editor-in-chief of MintPress, and I will be host. Detention without charges and intimidation was the order of the day for Ferguson, Missouri police again, with a heavily militarized police force continuing to bully protesters while also vowing to continue arresting journalists who are working to cover the situation in Ferguson after an unarmed black teen was shot and killed by a police officer over a week and a half ago. The ACLU says that the First Amendment has been suspended in Ferguson, and gone are the days of billy clubs and flashlights, which have been replaced with armored suits and gas masks. This, of course, is just the beginning, as the Department of Defense has been beefing up local police agencies with military-grade weapons, gearing them up for war. But as the media acts surprised by the militarization of police, civil liberty activists have been reporting this abuse of power by those who have been sworn to protect the community, not intimidate, since the early 1990s, when an earlier version of the National Defense Authorization Act was first introduced. Founder of People Against the NDAA, Dan Johnson, joins me today from Ferguson to talk about the parallels between the NDAA and the militarization of police, and why in the United States, home of the free, our police are gearing up for war, crushing peaceful protests and intimidating journalists. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me back on.
Let's talk briefly about what you're seeing on the ground in Ferguson. Is the First Amendment really suspended in Ferguson?
Not to say, it's an interesting way that the ACLU put it, I think, that the First Amendment is actually suspended. Have they officially suspended the First Amendment? No. But if we're going to talk in general terms, are they respecting it? Are they respecting people's right to protest? Are they respecting people's right to peacefully assemble? Are they respecting people's right to shout untoward things toward officers? No, not here. I have video, actually. I've been live streaming the past couple days from Ferguson, and I have video of officers ordering us off the main protest area, which was the burned out Quick Trip. So it's been the epicenter of protests for the past 10 days. And they ordered us off the area, and I asked them, well, okay, did the owner of this Quick Trip, because it's private property, did the owner ask you to remove us? Well, no. Well, then the police shouldn't have been there, because the owner has the right to have whoever on their property they want to have. Down there.
Well, we can't really discuss much. Operations security, you can't really tell much to anyone else other than they'll tell you civilian personnel.
Can you tell me if the road's blocked off there, so can someone... Okay, so someone can come down and use the okay.
This one's going to be able to get all this parking lot.
Alright. Makes sense for me to move that anyway. And they forced us to continue walking on public sidewalks, so we couldn't even stand still on a public sidewalk. I knelt down to grab an iced tea day before yesterday, and the officer told me to keep moving. And I said, well, hold on, give me a second. And he said, you're filming, keep moving. And I thought it was very interesting how they put that. You're filming, keep moving. You have a camera, keep moving. And they're differentiating between, if you're just someone walking amongst the street and you're not protesting, you have your First Amendment rights because you're not using them. But if you're someone who's protesting, you don't have your First Amendment rights. And they have been not only going after protesters, but also, as the entire world knows, they've been going after and arresting journalists. I think over 15 have been arrested in the past 10 days here in Ferguson, Missouri.
So let's talk a little bit about the parallels between the NDAA and the militarization of police. Tell me about the earliest version of the NDAA from the early 1990s, Program 1033.
So it's not necessarily the earliest version, because the NDAA has been around for 53 years. So it has been around for a while. However, one of the earlier versions of the National Defense Authorization Act had, as you said, Section 1033. And it's important to understand the NDAA, as we refer to it today, usually refers to the detention provisions in the 2012 version. However, the actual law just funds the military. That's all it's been doing for 53 some odd years. So putting into a military funding bill this Section 1033, and what this Section 1033 did is it essentially said, well, we have a lot of excess military equipment from our previous wars, and we're going to start granting that to local and county and state police departments. So we're going to start handing out, they're now handing out mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, but they started off handing out military hardware such as M16s, such as grenade launchers, such as a little bit smaller gear, and it was supposedly at first it was only for special weapons and tactics team or SWAT teams, and now it's been, obviously we can see it's being used in confrontations that have nothing to do with special weapons and tactics, and as one blogger referred to it, it's gone from special weapons and tactics to standard weapons and tactics. And we see the 1033 program start this off, and now Homeland Security also, they don't necessarily participate in the 1033 program, they have their own program, but they hand out military gear to police departments via grants. So the federal government overall is handing out a lot of military gear to police departments, to sheriff's departments all across the country. And one of the main arguments is terrorism, that this is going to protect us all from terrorists. And further, that it will keep the officers safe. Because if you argue against it, their first argument is not we're going after terrorists. First argument is, well, it's keeping officer safety as number one. You heard Captain Johnson say 2 nights ago that officer safety was number one. This is the kind of attitude of the police departments with this gear. And as we've seen in Ferguson, what puts the nail in the coffin of the final and most used argument that police departments need this military gear is it actually makes them less safe because the people they're going after with it start getting more violent. We watched protests go from just a memorial on Sunday. We had a military response to that memorial. There was no protest. It was a memorial for the young man who was shot. And the police responded very militarily. They didn't bring out their tanks, so to speak, but they brought out their M16s, their dogs, all kinds of stuff for a memorial, for essentially what was a funeral. And that escalated the protests into burning down the local gas stations, which then escalated the protest even further. And it's gone from protesters and people mourning to an interview I had with a young man the night before last who had a bandana over his mouth and a rose in his hand. And I asked him, well, don't you think those are kind of contradictory? You know, some people might think those are contradictory. He said, look, I'm prepared. I want peace. I'm going for peace. The rose is for peace. I want peace. But and he pulls his bandana up, I'm also prepared for war. The protesters have gone, especially the young people, have gone from peacefully protesting, and the more the police and in their military gear agitate the protesters out here, the more they're responding with slightly more violence. And I will say one more thing. I watched there's a basketball or football star walking around talking to young men. There's a group of young men around him, and he says, well, you need to be at peace with the police. We need to have peace here. We need to have calm here. We need to talk it out. And the answer from one of the young men was very telling. He said, man, it's a two-way street. If I'm going to go talk up to these police officers, he has a mask in front of his face. I'm not talking to him face-to-face like a man. I'm not talking to him face-to-face. It's a two-way street. Mm-hmm. And so this equipment is actually making the officers out here, it's not only prevalent, but it's making the officers out here very much less safe as it's turning peaceful people against them.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the people that you've been talking to on the ground, and I really appreciate you sharing that story. Who else have you talked to and interviewed? Have you talked to, in terms of like journalists and activists on the ground who are trying to bring attention to this aggressive brute force by the police?
I've mostly, my interviews have focused on Ferguson residents and people in the area, or sometimes people who came from outside the area. You know, mainstream media is going to interview the journalists. And there aren't that many activists on the ground here. It is not a very politically active community. In fact, I'm disappointed at the lack of outside activists who come in here to help. People are watching, but almost watching and going, well, I hope somebody else takes care of that. That's the feeling here. In talking to a lot of the residents on the ground, one thing they noted, they know about the situation with Rancher Cliven Bundy. That was a couple months ago in Nevada, right?
Right.
And they saw the Liberty community come out for him. And then they expected the Liberty community to come out for them, and they haven't been here. So there's a
I
sense.
was actually just about to ask you
Mhm.
about race in terms of this whole conflict. I know that many pundits, unfortunately, have really highlighted this liberty movement. Hey, where are you guys in terms of the issue in Ferguson? How do you respond to that?
I actually will let the Ferguson residents respond, and I've asked them about this. You know, is it a race issue? Some of them say it is. Some of them say it isn't. I think I have about 75 or 60% saying it isn't, and then about 25, 40% saying it is. And the reason that a lot of them are focusing on how it is, and one of the justifications they point out is look at Bundy Ranch.
Right.
There was a white rancher, and all those liberty people came out for him, and they brought a bunch of protesters with guns, and they said, look, we're unarmed. If we brought guns, we would be mowed down, and it would be okay because the world would see us as thugs. This is what I'm hearing from some of the residents there. And so they see not so much a profound, they see two things where race is an issue. Number one, with institutional racism down here. Keep in mind that the state of Missouri, the concealed carry permit, used to be a May issue. So if you come in here, we can choose to deny you a concealed carry permit. Well, then a study was done not that long ago that pointed out for 1,000 people who were arrested for only the crime, no other felony, only the crime of not having a concealed carry permit while concealed carrying a weapon, out of every 1,000 people, one of them was white.
Mm.
So they changed it to a shall issue now, as if you go in there, you will get one, a concealed carry permit, because of that. So there is a lot of institutional racism, and they pointed out the way the police treated them. There's a lot of institutional racism here, not so much among the community, but amongst the government and amongst the authority. And then another thing is they see the lack of response from the liberty community as what else? I mean, put yourself in their position. What else could they see it as? You have a white rancher a couple months ago who has a bunch of cattle, and they go out and defend them. And then you have the police. You have much more police. You have local and state coming down, and that also brings a reminiscent of the civil rights era to them. Well, you have local and state governments violating our rights, and the federal government sweeps in to help, but they only see the liberty community as wanting to fight the federal government and not the local. So again, they see whether the liberty community wants to send that message or not. The fact that they're not here sends the message that the mainstream media is correct, and that a lot of people in the liberty movement are, according to these Ferguson residents, at least racist in some capacity.
Right, and you're very plugged into the liberty movement, so I know that means a lot, especially coming from you as well. And so let's talk about how do we fix this. I mean, I know that has this set a precedent? I mean, I know that might sound kind of funny because we've been talking about the militarization of police for a very long time. Much of independent and alternative media has brought attention to this, but the media has been treating this as a polarized incident and as just enamored and shocked and surprised that this is even happening. So where do we go from here to fix this?
I think it's important to remember this is not a Ferguson issue. This is a national issue. There are signs out there, and the residents are telling me, look, this isn't just here. This is in other communities. This is in other cities. This is all over the country. And we are starting to see, we had town halls in Dallas. We had town halls in Pennsylvania. We had protests in Boston, protests in Atlanta. We are starting to see communities who have been concerned about police militarization already, because you see the comments. Just look, internet comments as a whole will give you an idea of the feelings of people in a certain area or on a certain group. And if you look at comments when pictures of mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles are given out to local police departments or local sheriff departments, they're overwhelmingly negative. They're overwhelmingly saying, "Look, this is a police state." And so you have this sentiment bubbling in America. And then you have Ferguson, and so you have all over the country now. They're starting to have these town halls. So how do you necessarily fix this? I think it's important to understand that because it's a national issue and not just a Ferguson issue, this is the best chance to fix it, first of all. This right here, with the mainstream media's attention, with people organized, with people upset, because what did Stalin say? One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. This is when it first comes out. So you either stop it here or it does become a precedent. One of the ways people in Ferguson can stop it is by firing their police chief, and by getting rid of the St. Louis County police chief and any other person involved in the military response down here, because it sends a message to every other police department that if you try this, your paycheck is on the line. Keep that in mind. For us in the nation, what do we do to stop this? Make sure your police department knows. And remember, your city council hires and fires your police chief, and you hire and fire your sheriff. So make sure your law enforcement in your community knows if they try this, they will lose their job. Make sure that is abundantly clear, whether it's through town hall meetings, whether it's through holding a protest of your own, whether it's even better going to the town hall, going to a city council meeting, going to a county commissioners meeting, going to a sheriff's meeting, expressing to them that if they do this, you will do everything in your power to make sure they no longer have that job.
So we are not powerless. The power is in our hands, and what you're saying is that we need to educate ourselves, because the best weapon at this point is to really educate ourselves about how this publicly funded entity, the police force, works, and get involved on a local level with our city council in terms of meeting those people and educate and voting those right people in. So how does your organization, People Against the NDAA, help fix this militarization of the police? And I know we've talked about this in a previous MintCasts, but I'd like to go over that one more time.
So before I answer that question, I actually want to point out one thing that's very important. You talked about educating ourselves. Remember that you imagine you have liberty on one side and you have the state on the other, and you have multiple chessboards. You don't just have one chessboard, you have multiple chessboards, multiple planes. If anyone has ever played a 3D game where I used to play a space battle game. So you had to be not only in the right area, but at the right height in order to meet the enemy coming toward you. Well, we have several chessboards here between the state and liberty. One of them is violence. Some people do say that as a last resort, we need a violent revolution. And another one that I can easily identify is ideas. As From Dictatorship to Democracy points out, the state always wins on the violence chessboard. Always. They profit from violence. They succeed from violence. They exist because violence exists. And so if you go after them with violence, you're only feeding that machine that you fight. But if you go after them with ideas, 2 nights ago I walked with a protest, no mainstream media around. There was a protest of 500 some odd peaceful people that walked out of the main protest area, down the road, all the way up to the police station. And no one was covering, or very few people were actually covering this. Because even in the face of such mass militarization, the vast majority of Ferguson residents have remained peaceful even as they're arrested, even as they're tear gassed, even as they're fired upon with rubber bullets. They've remained peaceful because they understand the power of an idea. And that's key, is ideas, spreading the idea, and how important that is in your community. Now, to address how does this fit in?
Right. And really with Panda, I'd really like to know how Panda is helping this effort to demilitarize the police.
So, when several days ago, the police looked like the military, acted like a military unit, more importantly, treated their people like a military unit, and like the military has treated people in this country every time they've been given control over a certain area. When that happened, and the only difference between the police and the military was one was under the imaginary command structure of the Department of Defense, and the other is under the imaginary command structure of the police department and local government, state government. When the only difference is their command structure, there is no difference at all. Now, we as an organization could hide behind and say, well, they're not the military, so we're not here for that. But practically, if they're treating their people like the military, they might as well be. So what we're doing down here, or what I'm doing down here particularly, I came down here on my own, not necessarily on behalf of the organization, though I'm bringing Panda a little bit into this now. But what we're doing is we're going to help the community politically organize, because I know how to do that, because we know how to do that, and make suggestions. You know, we're not running in as the knight on the white horse, and here's how you save Ferguson residents.
Right.
Because that's not right. It's their community. If they don't want their liberty, we can't force it on them. So I've been connecting with local community leaders and been offering my assistance. Tonight there is a town hall where they're going to be getting together talking about action. I will recommend that one of the actions is get people together to fire the police chief. There are city council members in Ferguson running for re-election. If they are pressured, they will fire the police chief. So the important thing is not so much a change in policy, but a change in perceived power. Right
and
now, the people...
That's what I was going to say, is really just empowering the local community to take power back into their own hands.
Yes, because they believe the power right now is with the police department. They believe the power right now is with the government. They believe the power right now, although it's a cherry on top, is within the voting system. But it's not, because you can't. People talk about vote fraud. You can't rig a vote where all the people are doing things other than voting and making sure that the entire community knows that that vote would be obviously rigged. So it's important not to just for them just go out and vote, but for them to show their city councilman and their city council person that they're not going away, and when it does come time to vote, and they might not even wait that long, they may organize a recall. But the goal down here is to help them recognize that they have the power. They already have it, but help them recognize that they have the power to do this, and then hopefully set an example for communities across the country that help those people recognize you have the power in your government. You just have to recognize you have it. It only takes 1 to 2% of the electorate to force a politician's hand. 1 to 2%. That's it. If you can get 1 to 2% of the registered voters, that's all you need, because that's how few people are engaged. So if we can hopefully teach the community to be engaged down here, set an example for the rest of the world, then instead of it being a precedent, it'll be a lesson.
So when are you planning on leaving Ferguson?
I have no idea. I didn't know how long I would stay here. I don't know when I'll be leaving. It really depends on if I am needed here. If I'm needed to be physically here. If I can organize by the phone, I haven't been home in a while, almost a week, so it'd be kind of nice to be home. But I'm going to be here as long as the community needs me, because that's what's important. That's why we're down here. So I guess I answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for joining me today. I mean, you've definitely answered many questions on the minds of many. It's always a pleasure. You can find this podcast through our MintPress iTunes channel and on our website, but the conversation is far from over, as we'd like to hear more from our readers and listeners on the subject of the NDAA and its parallels with the militarization of police. And if you think reform of our police is on its way, tweet at us using hashtag MintCasts and tell us what you think. You can also post on our Facebook page in the comment section of our pinned post featuring this podcast. Thank you so much for listening.